Hello, I'm Sophie. Welcome to my channel. I'm in Paris. I'm reading some things, as I so often am. I'm going to tell you about those things. I'm also doing a fair amount of walking around, visiting things. I'll take you along with me. It's going to be gas. Let's go.
Bibliosophie.
So I'm filming this a couple of days into the week on Wednesday, but when I got in on Monday, one of the first things I did was have dinner with Kieran Reader, that evening. 'Twas delightful. I'll have put in a tiny bit of that footage. We didn't take that much. So yeah, another deeply successful YouTube internet friend meetup. We had dinner together. We had very mediocre sangrias together. Much good cheer, talked about books and life and, you know, what have you. So I'm really glad that we managed to make that happen. What's on the docket this week? These three buddies. You'll recognize two of them. Actually, all three of them I've been talking about for a while. So obviously, The Magic Mountain is still very much on the docket. I have been listening to it mostly while walking around. Today in the Pompidou, I was listening to it and then I got kind of tired of listening to it, so I stopped. I don't want to talk about it today. I just don't have the courage. So that landed on my glasses. That's great. Death by Landscape by Elvia Wilk is a book that I already started talking about in my previous vlog. I'm about halfway through it, really enjoying it, and in this week's vlog I'll be talking about it. These are a series of essays, a lot of which were previously published in various other publications from something like 2018, 2017 on, we'll say, about fiction, writing, ecology, sociology, interpersonal dynamics, gender roles, and how all of those things overlap. And I'm really liking it. I've read the first two, almost finished the first two sections, which are Plants and Planets, and I've got the third section, Bleed, and then a short fourth section to read. So actually, I probably have read maybe a bit more than half. The first essay is called Death by Landscape, based on a Butler story? No, Margaret Atwood story, excuse me. And is about the role of landscape in science fiction. Oh, I did talk about this in my previous vlog, the trope of woman becoming earth, becoming plant, etc. But also more than that, what it says about how we narrativize the world, that landscape is backdrop, and who gets to be subject, what gets to be subject. But I do say who because, of course, there are also plenty of humans that do not really get to be subjects, who are also objectified in various ways. So Wilk is exploring the various iterations of what is subject, object, backdrop, foreground, narrative versus just this sort of stagnant landscape behind narrative, and all of the ways in which those get, I'll use a very academia jargony term, how those get kind of queered up. And there is plenty of queer theory to be had, especially in latter essays as well. Her bibliography is pretty delightful of people that she's drawing from. Some I know, some I don't, and I'm definitely taking various notes on other philosophers and artists and thinkers that I don't know about that are interesting me as a result of this book. There is an essay about, or that talks, there's definitely an essay about the Southern Reach trilogy, and actually specifically Annihilation of the Southern Reach trilogy, which also reminds me how good of a standalone that book is, and how it does a slightly different thing as a one quite short standalone novel than it does as part of a trilogy. And I like the trilogy. I definitely like Annihilation the most, and I kind of keep going back and forth as to whether I prefer to have the full trilogy, all of the information. It is, first of all, it's interesting, of course, and it scratches a sort of itch that we have when we read narratives about what's going on and having more information, world building. It's a fascinating setup that Vandermeer has put us in with Area X, this kind of growing landscape that is inhospitable to humans who keep trying to research it, but also inescapable, and very just all of the weirdnesses that happen there. So I definitely appreciated learning more about the what and a little bit about the why. But the magic of Annihilation on its own was just how little it cared about certainly the why. There was really almost no service to why is this weird shit happening, but even a lot of the what. It's so much of it is left quite in the dark, and there's a really magical aspect to that. That leaves us in a very, very introspective place as readers, and so I really appreciated that. She talks about Jenny Val's Paradise Rot, which I still haven't read. I read her Girls Against God, and I've talked about it on this channel several times. But I know that Paradise Rot is kind of the more popular book of hers, and I still haven't picked it up, but I love mushrooms. You can understand that sentence however you see fit. I'm not going to elaborate one way or the other. But I love the concept of fungus, and I think a lot of people do. It's this weird organism that feels very full of possibilities, and that's why mushrooms in all of their forms have become such a, let's say, not shortcut, keyword. Neither of those is the word that I'm looking for, but you know what I mean. This kind of representative of a lot of thoughts about interaction with nature, about how we structure society, how we structure care, how we conceive of reciprocity of self versus other, and plants as well. So a lot of that kind of thing is in this book. Mysticism, really some hot topics, and a lot about the point of writing fiction. Why approach things like science from a science fiction-ish adjacent thing, but also just a fiction basis? And what is the virtue of writing narrative fiction? What can it teach us? What can it do for us? What is the purpose of it? All right, I've talked a lot about this book. I don't know if I'll keep saying more, but I'm really, really enjoying it. I could go into every essay, but I won't. Well, I couldn't go into every essay because I just haven't read every essay. Speaking of things that I talk at great length about, Clarice, oh. So I have said in several, well, I've said in like every video I've posted this year, I'm reading a lot of Clarice Lispector. I've said in a bunch of my recent videos that I have been reading A Breath of Life, or Pulsations. I read a little over half of it in New York in May, about, let's say 2/3. Yeah, let's say 2/3. And I left it in New York. I didn't finish before I came to France. So, but then I got the desire after finishing Near to the Wild Heart last week to finish this book, which is her last. And I bought it yesterday in French. I've been wanting to read Lispector in French anyway. I've also been saying that. I went to La Librairie des Femmes, which is a delight. They actually put out some books, and they also carry books, a lot of books. That's what bookstores. Bookstores carry books, yes. They specialize in books by women. And so they have an edition house, they put out books by women, and they also carry books by women from other publishing companies. And I'm loving this. I'm actually about 40 pages from finishing this. I was reading it a goodly amount on my way to the museum this morning and also while queuing up at the museum. And this is maybe my favorite of hers. Also, as I've also said in every single other video in which I talk about Lispector, they're so similar to one another, and in a way that doesn't bother me, that it's hard to have a favorite, but this one does seem like a kind of sublimation of the themes. So far, and there's a couple of really hot hits. Like I have not read Passion According to GH, so we'll see. But some of her most popular books, famous books, I have not yet read. But this one, it is really magical, and there's a metafictional component in that she didn't finish it before she died, and it is about an author giving life to a character. So it's our constantly male author. This is Lispector yet again writing about a male author who writes about a woman in the way that she does, which is a fascinating gender performance. Sometimes that gender performance falls by the wayside a little bit, actually. And it's not really possible to know whether that's just because she left behind a somewhat fragmentary, quasi-unfinished manuscript, but at least certainly not heavily edited manuscript. It was not in its finished form. So would that have been edited out or not? One can't know. It's about the writerly urge to create themselves, but also another self, to understand the world, to create the world, giving the breath of life, but it's also about the subsequent death of that character. And it was written while the largest meta part of this, Clarice Lispector herself, the author, was dying, and she died before its publication. So it's a particularly cosmic soup of, speaking of mysticism, of it feels like almost a magical object in itself. I think it gets heightened in its mysticism by virtue probably of her having died before it was published, but also because of its subject matter. So I'm absolutely loving it. I have talked about it a little bit before, or actually not even that little bit. Maybe I'll do a long form dissection of it. That was a tangent. Yes, but French translation, as I thought, actually just feels a little bit more organic to me. And it has to do with what I am used to in French and how French sentence structure and French thought and French literature tends to unravel itself. So I have much more experience reading Lispector in English than I do in French, but so far, I don't know, it just feels way easier. I don't get in my head nearly as much when I'm reading Lispector in French, which is interesting and, as I said, not super surprising. So, make me actually write a damn paperlet about some of the thoughts I've been collecting about reading this book in particular. I have in my notes just chunks of paragraphs that I keep formulating upon reading. This is the most of her brain itchy books for me, by which I mean that I read this and I want to start writing. It just sets something off in me, and I start thinking and getting into this manic desire to write. So I do it in these chunks of paragraphs that I write on my phone usually, or in my iPad. And I should actually put it together in something. So I'm saying it to the internet in hopes of maybe writing something. Speaking of writing something, I'm gonna try to journal today. I want to journal a little bit more. It all goes together, but I'm goddamn lazy right now. Yeah, that's your chaotic update. Stay tuned. I read some more Magic Mountain, just a tiny bit. I wrote about the Magic Mountain, some notes about things I want to talk to you about, but I don't have the courage actually to talk about them today. So I think we're gonna keep pushing that off. I'm gonna talk a little bit more, always, about A Breath of Life, but actually not really about the book, and about more my experience of reading it in French. I haven't read any more since yesterday, but I was messaging with Nathan about the difference between the English and the French, and I mentioned, as I did yesterday in my video, that it's easier in French. It just flows more easily, it feels more sensical, less awkward, and he asked me if it felt different, how it felt different even. And I don't think it really does, actually. So it feels different as an experience to read it, but the ultimate picture kind of still coalesces into a similar thing. And I don't know if it's also because I already have read a fair amount of Lispector, so I have this broad database to draw from, but I think it's because it all kind of gets translated in my mind as a soup of feeling rather than specific language. I love specific language. I love specific quotations, citations. I love the interplay of specific words being put together. I have a passion for that. And I'm certainly underlining a lot in all of my Lispector books in English and in French, which has something to do with the specific words being used, but less so than in a lot of things, actually. Even though there are these really delicious twists of phrase that happen and that the translators are rendering, fundamentally, I kind of hold on to something beyond and sometimes even despite the words. So the overall feeling I have is not that different in English and in French, and that's not the case with other works. When I've read some translations of things I know in French, for instance, I definitely have a different vibe and often kind of an allergic reaction because, you know, my translator brain gets in the way, I guess, and I'm thinking, well, no, but I would have rendered this slightly differently, and by choosing this word, you're missing this nuance, or oh, that's interesting, or even if it's positive, but I'm just really like, and in this case, I haven't felt that so much. Something to know about me is that even though I adore language, I adore specific language, it's very much an obsession of mine, I don't really think in language so much. I am very, very much fully bilingual. English is technically my second language, but I've been speaking it for a very long time, and obviously I'm very, very comfortable in it. And so I switch between English and French extremely easily. I obviously have holes that happen. I can't find the word in one language or in the other language, depending. You've seen that happen many times on this channel if you watch me. But I don't narrativize my day-to-day so much in actual language. I talk to myself in a language, but my thoughts are kind of non-lingual. And that's actually kind of the reason why I'm constantly struggling to find the right word, because I have a simultaneous obsession with words and finding the most perfect, there can never be a perfect word, but the most perfect word that could create or partially create the color of my thought. And it doesn't immediately come into my mind. It doesn't come into my mind in words. It comes to my mind pre-verbally. So I think that has something to do with my understanding of Lispector, because so much of her writing is also about the process of finding words. Certainly this one is. And I tend to just mash it all up in this like cosmic stew of feeling more than other things. So I'm giving kind of an ambiguous answer of it's different, it feels different, definitely it's easier, it's smoother, and also it's kind of the same. It kind of amounts to the same currently for me. Granted, I've read a lot more in English than I have in French of Lispector, so maybe I just don't have enough data. But for now, that's kind of the situation. I'll also note that one of the things I do like about the English is because it does feel less smooth, it feels more awkward, it feels more foreign. And that is also kind of a hallmark of Lispector in Portuguese, in Brazilian, that her sentence structure, her sentences were somehow more European, somehow a little off. And you get more of that sense potentially in English because it doesn't flow as naturally from one Latin language to another. There's a kind of awkward edge, or kind of like an unpolished edge to even the most polished sentences, where it doesn't, the shape doesn't quite flow the way that English is supposed to flow to a certain extent. And partially it's related to just even the narrative or lack thereof sometimes, but even the kind of sentences, and again I'm going to use the word cosmic, feel more out of place in English, feel slightly more awkward, and I kind of like that. I don't know if I like it more than reading the French, I don't, but if I think that the language works probably better in French, I do have a soft spot in my heart for the angularity of some aspects of the English. It's sort of like when writers are influenced by other writers in other languages and then bring that kind of flow to the language that they write in. So I'm thinking, for instance, Ashbery being influenced by the symbolists and then bringing that sensibility into English where it helps to revolutionize the medium to a certain extent, and it just makes it, you're not following the same rules. So that's also a note that I have some affection for.
Les reproductions des dessins d'Yves Saint Laurent.
Good morning, hi. All right, a bit of Zauberberg update. I'm about 1/3 of the way through the book. What is my hair doing? What is my hair ever doing? And I'm currently a little bit bogged down by it, which is fine. It's a very long book, that kind of happens. This is very much a book that has almost no plot. In essence, the main character-ish that we're following, Hans Castorp, goes to a sanatorium in the Swiss mountains to go visit his cousin, and he's expecting to stay just a couple of weeks, and mild spoiler alert, he stays longer. He gets sick there and he enters into the world of the sanatorium as a patient and just kind of stays there vaguely ad infinitum. So there's really almost no plot. He meets various people there. They represent Europe at the turn of the 20th century. There are Russians and Italians, and so it kind of represents different ethnic groups of Europe. They represent also a bunch of different thought processes, political thoughts, social thoughts about where Europe was prior to the First World War. Mann begun this, I believe, it took him, I think, 12 years to write. He begun it, I believe, before the start of the First World War, but he finished it in the 20s afterwards. So his own relationship to Europe and Europe's relationship to itself evolved over the course of writing this book. There are lots of discussions. The book is really full of these long conversations between Hans, who's our sort of babe in the woods, naive boy, and the various people around him. So that can kind of get a bit boring. Is it too loud? Maybe I'm gonna shut the window. Peace and quiet. You're back to having me film from a city, so there are city sounds, there are intrusive city sounds. This is how it goes. As I was saying, metaphors, stuff, things. Mann has set up these characters really as representative icons of different thoughts, different modes of thought, different patterns even of literature and of social strata. Hans is really representative of an idle bourgeoisie. He's in his 20s, he's starting his career, and he's kind of a, for lack of a better word, kind of a good for nothing, like a beige flag good for nothing. He has no rudder, he has no particular knowledge of things. So he's constantly acting as the blank canvas onto which other characters can expostulate their thought processes and their political agendas, their sociological agendas. So he's a useful main character in that regard, but he's also a useful character because he kind of represents that Victorian, if you're talking about English particularly, but that early 20th century garden bourgeoisie who is really clueless by design and very much in their bubble. His cousin, Joachim, represents the much more civic-minded version of a kind of bourgeois person, and so he's a soldier. He is going to return to the army. He's also has got a certain naivete, but it's a less idle one. It's one that is all about social duty for a very specific kind of social stratum. So far, most of the longest conversations have been with Herr Settembrini, who's an Italian, and he is the humanist of the group. He has all of these thoughts about liberal mindedness, but from a humanist point of view. So he's constantly teaching Hans about all of his thought processes. His foil is going to be, we're going to see more and more of him, Nafta, who is originally a Jewish man who became a Catholic man. He became a Jesuit man, and he's representing the very radical side of things. So a more liberal, progressive, humanist approach versus a very radical approach, optimistic versus pessimistic, and the problems of both, but especially the pessimistic Nafta. And also radicalism that becomes revolutionary for its own sake, because he is not necessarily serving a progressive agenda. He's certainly not serving a constructive agenda. He's serving an agenda of revolution. So Mann, increasingly as the book goes on, is really pretty overtly represented in the character of Settembrini. Yes. The things that I like more than those kind of hot hits of representative what was going on at modernism is, as I mentioned in a previous video, the sense of time. That's such a huge component because time stands at a standstill, is at a standstill on the mountain. So days, months, years all kind of get melded into one another. Part of that is because of Hans's wishy-washiness. I'm really kind to him, aren't I? But that's what he's just like a sea jelly, basically, and by design. So part of that is our main character, but it's also very much a function of the sanatorium, and it's very representative of, again, in a larger scope, Europe on the verge, on the edge of something, on the edge of the new century, and teetering towards the world wars that are going to happen. There's this absolutely insulated and isolated bubble that happens, which is a hotbed of different European cultures and ripe for investigation as to what are the things to keep and what are the things not to keep, what are worth saving and what are the elements that are not worth saving about Europe. But it's also this standstill while the rest of the world is moving on and teetering towards a certain brink. So there's that juxtaposition that happens. There's a juxtaposition of kind of inner sickness or standstill versus outer as well. The concern regularly is, what is the psychological impact of a person onto their physical body? And we're getting into the beginnings of Freudism, or the beginnings of Freud being so popular and so consequential to how the world thinks. So that's also within the character's thought processes. What is sickness? There is very much the sickness as a social metaphor what causes it, how much of it is a psychological component, what does it mean? Is there a sin in sickness? Of course, I'm thinking about Sontag and her essay on illness as metaphor as well. So this is, and this is a recurrent theme from antiquity onward. What is the social impact of sickness? What is the cause of sickness? What are the causes of sickness? The people at the sanatorium are actually sick. They have, most of them, or at least Joachim has tuberculosis. So there is, just miasma exists, right? Sickness is real, bacteria and viruses exist, but there is also a sense that they are remaining sick because they're remaining in this bubble. They're getting sicker from staying in this bubble, which also feeds into the time aspect. So all of the layers of psychology and body are, to me, more interesting, but especially in how it relates to the concept of time and chronology. It's also because it's the thing that I, as a reader, can have a direct interaction with, because I'm reading this long book. That's why it's a long book. I meant to hold it up for the sake of being able to easily know where you are and what I'm talking about, but whatever. I'm not doing it today. I felt so unencumbered and free. I'm not doing the proper YouTube-y thingy. I interrupted myself and now I forgot the sentence that I was in the midst of saying. Yes, I as a reader can interact with time. I'm reading this very chunky book. That's why I thought about the chunky book. It's very long. It's very long by design because I'm also going through something. I'm going through an entire system of expectations and thoughts and my own chronology while I read it. I believe this takes place over 7 years. I'm not unspoiled, but obviously, ideally, it's not going to take me 7 years to read. However, the several weeks that it will take me to read, it is a factor in the reading of it. And that's what I like about long books, actually. Part of the process of understanding the story is also your own interaction with the length of it. And so my interaction with the boringness of it, the fact that I'm kind of getting like, okay, sure, Settembrini, yes, please tell me about this idea and that idea, and okay, sure, let's talk about this psychology. It's kind of all part of the design as well, which I like. I don't know if I'll ever reread this book, but the way that I will come back to it in however many months or years it will take me to come back to it will also be a factor. So I really like the play with how time is felt and recorded and understood, and chronology and narrative, because that's also the thing that I can interact with. And finally, the thing that I'm also liking and is, I think, going to be increasingly present is this concept of magic. Why is it called the Magic Mountain? Partially it's because it is a bubble, but the way that something unknowable is interacting with knowable things. So the intersection of medicine and all of this discussion as to somebody's nature and character, there is a certain magic in that, the nature around them, their understanding of time. There is all of this low-grade mysticism that comes into play from being in such an isolated situation. So that's a lot of thoughts about the Magic Mountain. This is going to be another very long vlog. Ciao for now. I have a few more thoughts on Death by Landscape that I'm going to try to briefly share. There is a recurring theme throughout the sections and essays of the book, whether they be more kind of planetary, more plant or nature related, having to do with the body, having to do with experience, virtual experience, and throughout narrative, which is a desire for an investigation of, a case for a certain thickness of understanding, of narrative, of even analysis. And I use the word thickness in this case both as itself, more generally, but also as a reference to Tressie, McMillan, Cottom, and her book Thick, which is a series of essays in which she advocates for a thickness of a vision in writing essays against an overly streamlined, overly funneled vision of the world. So there are parts of various essays that in here that have to do with over-analysis or trying to pinpoint something. I find it very, very interesting that so much of this book is about the natural world and its interaction with human experience and narrative. It's partially from an ecological bent, but there's such a long history of human beings, and especially white human beings, especially white male human beings, interacting with the natural world from a place of dominion and using nomenclature, analysis, dissection, taxonomy as a means of conquering the natural world, of systematizing it. And that sense of what order and orderliness is informs what our sense of intellectualism is, and also of narrative, who gets to tell narratives and in what way. So it just funnels through how we understand so much of the world in this very, pyramid of this leads to that, this is over this, there is a hierarchy, and this is related to this. It's a very, very, it's how we understand genre, it's how we understand, or so many of us understand genre and cause and effect, and it irradiates through so much of our understanding. So a lot of it, however, is deeply problematic. I think it's impossible for human brains not to want to categorize and organize, but the way we do so always risks, to some extent, misunderstanding, willfully misunderstanding or accidentally misunderstanding, making overly small, making overly neat, making overly streamlined things, and not allowing for things to be messy. There is a really good quotation that Wilk has at one point, her own. She writes the sentence, interpretive digging is like jealousy. And yeah, sometimes you just have to let a work be itself a little bit. You don't have to have a one-to-one understanding of absolutely every element of every part of a work or of a person or of a situation. And that's extremely interesting to me, just allowing things to live with a certain amount of opacity, ambiguity, thickness, and not attempt an overly extractivist interpretation or relationship to it. In a later essay, maybe the second to last essay, I think, she talks about the composting of a book, which I really like as an image, that a book kind of composts ideas, and that's a really lovely way to acknowledge both the fact that it is recycling other people's ideas and words and thoughts, so it's part of a history in that way, but then it also seeps into a culture as compost itself rather than a very, very linear analysis. It allows for a more seeping approach, and so I like that it's a more maybe chaotic, maybe more organic aspect, counter, I guess, to a really extractivist dissection of things, of conquest of narratives and materials, and just to kind of allow materials to compost and seep as part of your life and your own writing. So those are my thoughts on that. Thank you so much for joining me on another round of thoughts on books. I'll talk about them again in a June wrap-up, I'm sure, but maybe not in too much detail because I have talked so much about them here. Anyway, thank you so much. Bisous bisous et à la prochaine.